The walls of Xiangyang were not the tallest in China. They were not the thickest. By the standards of the great fortress cities of the Song dynasty, they were almost ordinary. And yet, for 6 years, those ordinary walls held back the largest land empire the world had ever known. The Mongols, who had erased the Khwarezmian Empire in 2 years, who had broken Baghdad and Kiev and the kingdoms of the Jin, stood in the mud outside this single city on the Han River and could not get in. The year was 1273, and Kublai Khan had already decided that the conquest of all China would be decided here, in front of these walls. He was right, but not in the way he expected. Because somewhere on the ramparts of Xiangyang stood a weapon so large it had to be mounted on a frame. A weapon that fired a bolt the length of a grown man. A weapon the Chinese called the Chuangzi Nu, the bled crossbow. And on a single day of fighting, according to the Song military records, a battery of these weapons is said to have killed as many as 10,000 of the Khan's soldiers in a matter of hours. So how did one weapon stall the unstoppable Mongol war machine for 6 years? How did an army that had conquered half the known world find itself bleeding to death against the walls of a city most people today have never heard of? And what was the single, devastating decision that finally brought Xiangyang down? A decision that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with engineering. Here is exactly what I'm going to walk you through. First, the weapon itself, the bled crossbow, how it was built, what it could do, and why a single bolt from one of these machines could punch through a Mongol shield, the man holding it, and the man standing behind him. Second, why Xiangyang was the one city in all of China that the Mongols could not afford to bypass, and why its position on the Han River made it the cork in the bottle of the entire war. Third, the brutal mathematics of the siege, 6 years of tunnels, towers, river battles, and starvation, and the supply run that became one of the most desperate rescue missions in military history. Fourth, the foreign engineers who arrived in 1272 and changed everything by building a weapon even larger than the bled crossbow. And fifth, the moment of surrender, what finally broke the defenders, why it was not the wall and not the crossbow that failed, and what the fall of this one city meant for the largest population on Earth. Let me begin with the weapon, because the weapon is the reason this story exists. A handheld crossbow is a known thing. A man braces it, draws the string, and looses a bolt that might kill at 100 paces. The bled crossbow was something else entirely. Imagine a crossbow scaled up until a single man could no longer draw it. Then imagine 2 crossbow staves, sometimes 3, mounted in series on a heavy wooden frame the size of a cart, their power combined through a system of cords and pulleys. The string was not drawn by hand. It was winched back by a team of men turning a windlass, sometimes 10 men or more, ratcheting the tension up notch by notch until the frame itself groaned. To understand the scale of this, you have to understand the engineering trick at the heart of it. A single bow stave can only store so much energy before the wood or the horn and sinew composite reaches its limit and snaps. The Song engineers got around that limit by linking multiple staves together, sometimes mounting a second bow facing backward so that the two pulled against each other and multiplied the draw. The 11th century Chinese military encyclopedia, the Wujing Zongyao, the complete essentials for the military classics, compiled around 1044 under the Song court, describes exactly these machines, with diagrams of single bow, double bow, and triple bow versions, and gives them names like the Lying Tiger and the drawn and shot bow. The draw weights involved were not in the range of a strong man's arm. They were in the range of thousands of pounds, the kind of force that only a windlass and a ratchet could manage, the same principle that lets a single person jack up a multi-ton car. The bolt it fired was not an arrow. It was closer to a spear, fletched with iron or leather veins, tipped with a heavy forged head. The Song engineers had several types. The triple bow versions, the ones military manuals called the strongest, could throw a bolt with enough force to cross hundreds of yards and still arrive with the power to nail a man to the ground. The Wujing Zongyao claims ranges for the largest of these engines well over 1,000 paces. And while medieval range claims are always generous, even a fraction of that figure put the bolt far beyond the reach of a hand-drawn bow. Some accounts describe bolts being driven so deep into the earth or into a city's wooden defenses that soldiers could climb them like rungs on a ladder. There is a famous episode from earlier Song history, the defense against the Tangut Western Shah, in which a single bed crossbow bolt was used to kill an enemy commander at a distance everyone had assumed was safe. A shot that ended a battle by removing one man. A single hit did not wound. It destroyed. The forged iron heads on these bolts were not the slender bodkin points of an arrow meant to slip between the rings of mail. They were heavy chisels of metal, traveling with the momentum of a thrown spear multiplied many times over, and against the lamella armor and wooden shields of a 13th century soldier, that momentum did not stop at the surface. It carried through. And here is the detail that the simple word crossbow hides. These were not anti-personnel weapons in the way an archer is, they were artillery. The Chinese deployed them in batteries along the walls, and they aimed them not at individual men, but at the dense formations the Mongols needed to bring forward in a siege, the crews pushing siege towers, the columns advancing toward the gates, the men crowded at the base of the wall trying to plant ladders. Against a tight mass of soldiers, a bolt that could pass through one body and into the next was a horror. It did not stop at the first man. The records that speak of 10,000 dead in a single engagement are describing this. Not 10,000 individual aimed shots, but battery fire pouring into a packed assault. Bolt after bolt tearing lanes through the crowd. Think about the grim mathematics of it. A siege requires the attacker to concentrate force at a single point, to mass men and machines at the foot of the wall, because that is the only way to get over it or through it. But concentration is exactly what makes a formation vulnerable to a weapon that punches through ranks. The very thing the Mongols had to do to take the city was the thing that fed the bed crossbows their targets. Every assault that pressed close enough to threaten the wall pressed close enough to be cut to pieces. This is why the Mongols, who could ride down armies in the open field, found themselves trapped in a problem with no good solution. The closer they got to victory, the denser their men had to stand. And the denser they stood, the more efficiently the bolts killed them. Now hold that image, because we will come back to it. We will come back to it at the worst possible moment for the people inside these walls. Why Xiangyang? Of all the cities in China, why did Kublai Khan stake the entire conquest on this one place? Look at the map of southern China in the 13th century, and you see a single, overwhelming feature: the Yangtze River, vast and wide, the natural moat that protected the entire Song heartland. North of the Yangtze, the Mongols ruled. South of it lay the richest, most populous civilization on Earth. More than 50 million people, the cities of Hangzhou and the rice lands that fed them. Hangzhou alone, the Song capital, may have held more than 1 million people, making it almost certainly the largest city in the world at that time. A place the later traveler Marco Polo would describe as beyond anything in Europe. This was a civilization that had invented paper money, the magnetic compass, movable type printing, and gunpowder weapons, and that produced more iron in a year than England would produce centuries later. To conquer the Song, the Mongols had to cross the Yangtze. And to cross the Yangtze with an army, with cavalry, with supplies, they needed a corridor. That corridor was the Han River. The Han is the great tributary that flows down into the Yangtze, and it was the highway that led from the Mongol-held north straight into the soft underbelly of Song China. The geography here is decisive. An army moving south by land had to cross range after range of hills and a tangle of waterways, slow going for the supply trains and the heavy siege equipment that any campaign against walled cities required. But the Han offered a water road, and water transport in the pre-modern world was an order of magnitude cheaper and faster than moving the same tonnage over land. Control the Han, and you could float an army and everything it needed straight down to the Yangtze. Guarding that highway, sitting astride the river like a lock on a door, were twin fortress cities, Xiangyang on one bank and Fancheng on the other, linked by a pontoon bridge across the water. Together, they controlled the river. As long as they held, no Mongol fleet could move south, and no Mongol army could safely pass. The Song understood this perfectly. For decades, Xiangyang had been built up into the strongest river fortress in the empire. Its walls were faced with brick and stone. Its moat was not the usual narrow ditch. In places, it was widened to more than 100 yards across, fed by the river, too broad to bridge under fire, too deep to fill. That single number, 100 yards of water, tells you why the place was so nearly impregnable. Because the standard siege techniques of the age all depended on getting men and machines up against the wall. And a moat that wide kept everything at arm's length, while the defenders fired down into anyone who tried to close the gap. Inside, the garrison was provisioned for a long fight, and the river itself was its lifeline, the road by which food and reinforcement could come up from the Song interior. The twin city arrangement doubled the strength of the position. Neither Xiangyang nor Fancheng could be taken in isolation, because each could shelter the other across the pontoon bridge, sending men and supplies across the water faster than the attacker could shift his forces around the long way. To break the lock, the Mongols would have to break both halves of it at once, or sever the bridge that joined them, and for years, they could do neither. So, when the Mongols arrived to begin the siege in earnest, they faced a problem they had rarely faced before. They could not starve a city that the river kept feeding. They could not storm walls that the bed crossbows swept clean. And they could not simply ride around it, because to leave Xiangyang at their backs was to leave the door to China locked behind enemy hands. An army that bypassed the fortress would have its supply line cut the moment it pushed south, with the Song fleet free to come up behind it on the river. The greatest cavalry empire in history had run into a target that cavalry could not solve. They would have to learn to do something Mongols were not famous for. They would have to learn to sit and wait and besiege. That waiting became one of the longest sieges in the medieval world. The Mongol commanders, chief among them the General Arju and the Chinese defector Liu Zheng, settled in for a campaign measured not in weeks, but in years. Liu Zheng matters here more than the histories usually admit, because it was he, a former Song officer who knew the Han River system from the inside, who reportedly convinced Kublai that the whole conquest of the south hinged on this one corridor, and who urged the building of a river fleet to fight the Song on the water, where they had always been strongest. The steppe horsemen who had grown up in the saddle now had to become shipwrights and sailors, training tens of thousands of men to fight on the river, because they had understood the one truth that mattered. You could not take a river fortress without first taking the river. They began to do what the steppe horsemen had learned from the engineers of every civilization they had swallowed. They built. They threw up a ring of forts and earthworks around the twin cities, a wall around the walls, cutting the land routes. They stationed fleets on the river to choke the water route. Slowly, methodically, they began to strangle Xiangyang and Fancheng from the world outside. This was the Mongol genius that gets overshadowed by the image of the mounted archer. They absorbed the expertise of everyone they conquered: Chinese siege engineers, Persian artillerists, Korean shipwrights, and turned the knowledge of the settled world back against the next settled world in their path. But the defenders fought back at every layer. When the Mongols dug tunnels to undermine the walls, the defenders dug counter-tunnels and met them underground in the dark. This was a brutal and specialized kind of war, fought by lamplight in cramped galleries where men killed each other with knives and smoke and flooded each other out, and where a single collapse could bury a dozen men alive on either side. When the Mongols pushed forward siege towers and assault formations, the bled crossbows opened up from the ramparts and the great bolts came scything down. And the towers burned, and the formations broke. Year after year the assaults came, and year after year the walls held, and the cost in Mongol lives climbed into figures that would have ended the career of any commander in any other army. And this is worth pausing on, because the Mongols were not patient by temperament. Their whole way of war was built on speed, on the lightning campaign that broke an enemy before he could gather his strength. Khwarezm had taken 2 years. Whole kingdoms had fallen in a single season. To commit to a siege of this length was to fight against everything the Mongol army was good at. And they did it anyway, because Liu Zheng had convinced the Khan that there was no other road south. And through all of it, the river kept the city alive. Barely. The Song court, far to the south, knew that if Xiangyang fell, the war was lost. So they sent help up the Han, and one of those relief attempts became a story that the defenders would remember for the rest of their lives. In the year 1272, with the city ground down by years of blockade and supplies running critically low, 2 Song officers named Zhang Shun and Zhang Gui assembled a relief flotilla. They loaded 100 paddle wheel boats with cloth, with salt, with everything a starving garrison needed, and they prepared to run the gauntlet of the Mongol fleet to reach the city. The paddle wheel boats are a detail worth holding onto because they were a Song specialty, vessels driven by men working treadmills that turned wheels along the hull, capable of moving against the current and through still water without depending on wind or oars. Exactly the kind of craft you would want for a sprint through a blockade. They knew the odds. Before they set out, it is said, they told their men plainly that this was a mission from which many would not return, and that any man who did not have the stomach for it should leave now. Not one left. They went at night, down the river, fighting through chain barriers strung across the water, through fire arrows and Mongol war junks, hacking and burning their way forward in the dark. The Mongols had done what besiegers always do to a river. They had spanned it with chains and floating barriers and anchored vessels, turning the open water into a series of traps. The Song boats had to break each barrier in turn, men leaning out under fire to cut chains and haul aside booms while the arrows came down. They broke through. The flotilla reached Xiangyang, and the supplies were delivered, and for a moment, the besieged city saw the impossible, a fleet that had punched a hole straight through the Mongol blockade. But the cost was terrible. Zhang Shun did not survive the run. His body was found days later, the records say, still upright in his armor, pierced by 4 spears and an arrow, having died facing the enemy. He had brought his men through, and he had not lived to see it. That single supply run tells you everything about why this siege lasted so long. It was held together by men who would die in their armor rather than abandon the river. But it also tells you something darker. A relief mission that heroic, that costly, succeeded only in buying a little more time. It did not break the siege. It delivered cloth and salt and a moment of hope, but it did not lift the ring of forts, it did not sink the blockade fleet, and it did not give the defenders any new way to strike at an enemy who was learning, slowly, to stay out of reach. It only delayed the ending. And the Mongols, watching their losses mount and their assaults fail, had finally come to the same conclusion the defenders feared most. If the wall could not be stormed and the bed crossbow could not be silenced by men, then the answer was to find a weapon that could outreach the wall itself. They had spent 6 years learning what did not work. Now they were about to import what did. So Kublai Khan sent for engineers from the other end of his empire. This is the turning point, and it is the part of the story that most accounts skip past too quickly, because it changes everything about how Xiangyang finally fell. The Mongol Empire by this point stretched from China to Persia, and Kublai's relatives ruled the lands of the old Islamic world, where engineers had perfected a different kind of siege engine entirely. Kublai's nephew Abaka ruled the Ilkhanate in Persia, and it was from that western branch of the family that the request for engineers was answered. In 1272, 2 such engineers arrived at Xiangyang. The Chinese sources named them Ismail and Ala al-Din. They came from the west, from the region of Mosul and Persia, and they brought with them the design for the counterweight trebuchet, the weapon the Chinese would afterward call the Hui Hui Pao, the Muslim trebuchet, and sometimes the Xiangyang Pao, named for the very city it was about to break. Understand what this meant. The Chinese had long used the traction trebuchet, a stone thrower powered by teams of men hauling on ropes. It was effective, but its range and its power were limited by how many men could pull and how hard, and by how perfectly they could all pull at the same instant. A traction engine threw lighter stones at shorter range, and its power was capped by human muscle and human coordination. The counterweight trebuchet replaced those men with a colossal hanging weight, tons of stone or earth in a box at the short end of a long arm. When released, gravity did the work, and gravity does not tire, does not flinch under arrow fire, and does not need to be fed. The arm swung with a force no rope team could match, and it hurled stones of immense weight far beyond the reach of any traction engine, far beyond the range of arrows, and crucially, far beyond the effective range of the men on the walls. The physics is simple and merciless. The energy a counterweight trebuchet delivers comes from the mass of the weight multiplied by the height it falls, and there is no human limit on either number. Pile on more stone, build the frame taller and stronger, and the machine throws harder. The Chinese sources record these engines throwing stones of well over 100 pounds. Some accounts say 150 catties and more, a weight that no traction engine could have launched anything like as far. This was the answer to the bed crossbow. The crossbow batteries dominated the killing ground in front of the walls. But the new trebuchets could stand back, out beyond that killing ground, and throw stones weighing hundreds of pounds in a high arc that came down inside the city and on top of the defenses, while the crossbows could not reach the crews operating them. For the first time in 6 years, the Mongols had a weapon that could strike Xiangyang without paying the bed crossbow's price. The whole geometry of the siege inverted in an instant. For 6 years, the contest had been about the ground in front of the wall, a zone the defenders ruled absolutely. The counterweight trebuchet made that zone irrelevant because it fought from a place the defenders could not touch, lobbing its stones over the moat and the wall and the killing ground altogether. Everything Xiangyang had been designed to do, to dominate the approach, to keep the enemy at arm's length, was suddenly answering a question the enemy had stopped asking. They turned the new engines on Fancheng first, the sister city across the river. The great stones came down, and Fancheng's defenses were broken, and the city was stormed and put to slaughter. A deliberate horror, carried out within full view of Xiangyang across the water, so that the people on the other bank would understand exactly what awaited them. The Mongols had used massacre as policy across the whole span of their conquests, not from blind cruelty, but as a calculated instrument. A city that resisted and was annihilated taught the next 10 cities to open their gates. Fancheng was that lesson written in blood, staged on a riverbank where the intended audience could not look away. Then the pontoon bridge linking the two cities was cut, and Xiangyang stood alone. The lock had been built as a pair, and now one half of the pair lay in ruins, and the bridge that had let them support each other was gone. Everything the twin city design was meant to provide, mutual reinforcement, shared supply, the strength of two fortresses acting as one, had been stripped away in a matter of days. And then they turned the trebuchets on Xiangyang itself. The accounts describe the sound of the stones striking the city as a noise like thunder, a sound that shook the buildings and that the defenders had never heard before. One of the great projectiles is said to have struck a tower inside the city with such force that the impact was felt through the ground, and the chronicles record that the people who heard it were seized with terror, that the noise alone broke the will of men who had stood firm under 6 years of conventional assault. That is the part worth dwelling on. These were not soft defenders. They had faced tunnels and towers and starvation and had not bent. What broke them was the arrival of a force they had no framework for, a weapon that struck from nowhere with a sound like the sky cracking open. The defenders had weapons that could kill any man who came close. They had no answer for a weapon that never came close at all. So now we arrive at the moment of surrender, and at the thing I told you at the very beginning that this story turns on. The decision that finally brought Xiangyang down had nothing to do with courage, and everything to do with engineering. For 6 years, the garrison of Xiangyang had done everything a fortress could do. Their walls held, their countertunnels held, their bed crossbows had killed Mongols by the thousands and broken assault after assault. Their commander, a general named Lu Wenhuan, had endured a blockade that would have broken almost any other defense in the medieval world. He had held when the land routes were cut, held when the food ran low, held through the years when the Song court could send him nothing but the occasional desperate flotilla. They were not beaten by a lack of will. They were beaten by physics. The counterweight trebuchet had simply outranged everything they had. A defense built around dominating the ground in front of the wall is helpless against a weapon that ignores the ground in front of the wall and drops death from above, from a distance the defenders cannot reach. There was no countermeasure available to Lu Wenhuan, no sortie that could reach the trebuchet crews across that distance, no wall that could be built high enough to stop a stone falling out of the sky, no bed crossbow that could outrange a machine specifically positioned beyond its range. For the first time in 6 years, the defenders faced a problem with no answer inside their walls. With Fancheng destroyed before his eyes, his sister city slaughtered, his own walls now being smashed from beyond his weapon's reach, and no relief coming from a Song court that had run out of Jiang Shuns to send, Lu Wenhuan made his choice. In 1273, after 6 years of resistance, he surrendered Xiangyang to the Mongols. The terms reportedly spared the city the fate of Fancheng, and that mercy was itself a weapon, the other half of the lesson the massacre had taught. Resist and be annihilated. Submit and be spared. After 6 years of holding the most important door in China, the man who held it concluded that there was nothing left to hold it with. And here is why this one city mattered more than almost any other in the entire history of the Mongol conquests. The lock on the Han River was broken. The corridor into southern China was open. Lu Wenhuan, the man who had held the door for 6 years, now went over to the Mongol side and helped guide their advance down the rivers he knew so well. And his defection mattered as much as his city, because a commander who knew the Song River defenses from the inside was worth an army to the men now pouring south. Within a few years, the Mongol armies poured south under the general Bayan, crossed the Yangtze, and rolled up the Song dynasty one city at a time, many of them surrendering without a fight once they saw that the Great Barrier had fallen and that resistance now meant the fate of Fancheng. By 1279, the last Song resistance was extinguished at the Sea Battle of Yamen off the southern coast, where the official Lu Shufu, seeing that all was lost, is said to have strapped the imperial seal to his back, taken the boy emperor Zhao Bing in his arms, and leapt into the ocean rather than let him be captured, and where tens of thousands of loyalists are said to have drowned themselves in the days that followed. 50 million people, the most advanced civilization on Earth, fell under Mongol rule. And Kublai Khan became the ruler of a unified China, the founder of the Yuan dynasty, the first foreign ruler to hold the whole of the country. It began at Xiangyang. It began with one weapon that held the wall, and ended with another weapon that reached over it. And that is the lesson buried inside this siege. The thing the bed crossbow teaches that goes far beyond the 13th century. A defense is only ever as good as the assumptions it is built on. The bed crossbow was a masterpiece. It dominated everything it could see. The fortress was designed around its strength, the wide moat, the brick walls, the killing ground swept by those enormous bolts. And for 6 years it worked perfectly, against every weapon the Mongols knew. The fortress did not fall because it was weak. It fell because the enemy changed the rules of the game and brought in a weapon that the entire design had never accounted for. The defenders won every fight they had prepared for. They lost the one they had not imagined. And notice where the killing blow came from. Not from the steppe, not from the Mongol tradition at all, but from Persian engineers brought halfway across the world by an empire that made a habit of stealing the best ideas of everyone it touched and pointing them at the next target. Xiangyang was not beaten by the Mongols alone. It was beaten by the whole accumulated knowledge of a connected world, arriving all at once at the one wall that had no answer for it. If you want to go deeper into the weapons of this siege, I have put together a free illustrated breakdown called the Xiangyang Siege File. It lays out the bed crossbow and the counterweight trebuchet side by side, with the ranges, the construction, and the timeline of the 6-year siege drawn out year by year, plus the maps of the Han River corridor that make the whole strategy click into place. You can get it at the link in the description. It is free, and there is nothing to buy. If this story held you the way it held me, the most useful thing you can do is leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because every subscriber tells the algorithm to carry these forgotten sieges to one more person who has never heard them. The next file we open is the Siege of Alesia, where Julius Caesar trapped himself between 2 armies on purpose and somehow walked away the winner. And the engineering decision he made there is even stranger than the one you just heard. And if you know someone who loves military history, someone who would appreciate how a single weapon stalled the largest empire on Earth for 6 years, send them this video. Some stories deserve to be passed from one person to the next, and the defenders of Xiangyang earned that much. I will see you at the next siege.